It's my nerd world. But that doesn't mean you're not invited in. It is my nerd world, and welcome to it, a Star Wars podcast. And on the show this week, we'll discuss the latest episode of The Bad Batch, a show that I am thoroughly enjoying, and I hope that you're enjoying it as much as I am. We'll get into, well, I don't want to phrase this, a little bit of the social networking being the major driving factor in the negativity around Star Wars. There's an outlet that I've used on the show recently that I thought was a credible source, and I may have to take that back now. So I'll share, obviously, with you what it is I'm talking about. Plus, something that I'm going to do over a series of podcasts from now moving into the future, and that is continued discussion around the Rise of Skywalker, and specifically why the Rise of Skywalker isn't talked about with such in-depth analysis as The Last Jedi is. And there's a number of reasons for that, I realize. But I think there's one big reason why that I'll share with you on the show. And we'll couple that with the fact that, in my personal opinion, I think J.J. Abrams and Chris Terrio deserve a heck of a lot more credit for The Rise of Skywalker than they get. And I'll even be so bold as to say that I think that they deserve the same level of commentary surrounding what they created in The Rise of Skywalker as Rian Johnson did for The Last Jedi, even if there are individuals that didn't like what J.J. Abrams and Chris Terrio did with the story that Rian Johnson set up in The Last Jedi. Also, we will I'll share the comparisons between the now Legends Dark Empire comic book series and The Rise of Skywalker, because it seems pretty clear that a lot of inspiration for the story of The Rise of Skywalker was lifted from that Dark Empire series. So I'll tell you, I believe it's 5 different comparisons between both of those pieces of content. I'm glad you're with the show this week. As always, if you want to check out everything with regard to My Nerd World, you can go to mynerdworld.net, and the show is brought to you by the EMBARK science fiction space opera series, written by yours truly, Jon Justice. 5 books available now in ebook, paperback, and audiobook, with the books 6 and 7 to round out the series, coming later this year. I'll have more details for you later on in the show. But for now, let's go ahead and get into it. I'm so glad you're with My Nerd World, a Star Wars podcast this week.
It's an instinct. A feeling. The Force brought us together. We're not alone. Good people will fight if we lead them.
People keep telling me they know me. No one does.
But I do.
Long have I waited. And now, you're coming together. Is your undoing.
Confronting fear is the destiny of a Jedi. Your destiny. The Force will be with you.
Always.
My Nerd World.
It is a Star Wars podcast, and I'm your host, Jon Justice. Glad you're with the show again this week. I want to present to you an exciting money-making idea. Almost sounds like a PSA, doesn't it? No, I was thinking about this, and I've been thinking about this ever since I listened to one of the most recent episodes of a Galaxy of Toys podcast. And I didn't realize the way in which retail outlets restock their shelves. I'm going to talk collecting here for just a moment. I like to collect Star Wars toys. I'm not a completist by any stretch. I just like to go and get the particular items that I'm into, right? It's a part of my fandom. I've talked about that a ton on the show. But I didn't realize this until listening to the Galaxy of Toys podcast when one of the guests on the show laid this out. We don't have here, depending on where you're listening to this, here in America, we don't have a major just-to-toy retail chain anymore for the most part. We certainly don't here in Minnesota. Like, if I had the money available to invest, I'll tell you exactly what I would open. Because we don't have, like, a Toys R Us anymore, where they have a different method of stocking their shelves, If you're a Star Wars collector, you want to go buy Star Wars toys, it's really difficult to find the new items that are released because the way that these major retailers stock their shelves, and we'll use Target and Walmart as an example, is they have their algorithms that order the supplies in their store, and often, I think they do. Each item that gets stocked on the store is applied a number that particular store needs to sell of that item to meet the expected demand. So we'll use, like, screwdrivers, for example. If a Target or a Walmart store needs to sell 2 screwdrivers a week, then they only stock their shelves so that they make sure that there's those 2 screwdrivers that are on the shelves per every week, and therefore the ordering that gets done is based off of that. That's applied to all the products in the store. Well, when you look at something like collectibles and specifically Star Wars toys, when a Target gets a new batch of Star Wars toys, which doesn't come out nearly as much as it used to, I think Hasbro's doing their best to try to navigate their way in the world that we live in now and the changing dynamics of toy collecting. But when they get a new batch of Star Wars toys, there are individuals out there that will go and buy the majority of the ones that they know are going to sell that the fans want, and then they'll sell them on secondary outlets. They'll sell them on the Facebook Marketplace or on eBay, right? Well, the store then takes those sales to mean, oh, well, you've reached beyond the quota. You were only supposed to sell 1 Grief Karga, this week, and so you've sold 4. So we're not going to restock you, though, because you've already met 4 weeks worth of sales for that. So it makes it really difficult when you're an individual like me and you want to go out and say, buy some of the Retro Series figures. You can't find them in the stores because other individuals have already gone and purchased them. It's gone beyond what the algorithm said that store was supposed to sell, and therefore there's no rush on them restocking them. If I had the money, I'd open up a straight-up toy store nowadays. A store that had a section for consignment where you can bring in older toys. There's a place about 45 minutes from where I live here in Minnesota. It's just this little hole. It's tools and toys, little hole-in-the-wall shop. And the guy sells tools and toys. And he actually seeks out lots of old Star Wars toys to sell. That's where I more recently picked up some really cool old Shadows of the Empire figures, and I put them up on my Instagram. You can go and check that out at the Jon Justice. But if I had the money to go and invest, I would open a straight-up regular old toy store that carried all of the latest Hasbro Star Wars toys, so that if you were a collector, you could always go and find what it is you were looking for, along with a consignment area where I would go and buy lots of older Star Wars toys, along with other toys as well, because this applies to other intellectual properties too. So just wanted to kick off the show and talk about that a little bit, because I like collecting, and it's frustrating when you can't. I like to go out to the physical store, to the physical stores, and find these things. It's part of the fun of it. But I suppose I should probably change my buying habits, since, well, I just told you why. It's really difficult to go and find these things out in the wild. All right, so let's start off the show here, and I just want to talk briefly about the Bad Batch. Plenty of other podcasts are breaking down every single episode and providing commentary. So really what I want to do is just sort of share with you my initial thoughts of the latest episode and my ongoing thoughts about the series, the series itself. I'm fully enjoying the Bad Batch. It was off to a, it started off great. a rousing start to the series, and now it's kind of moved into what I expected it to, so it's meeting expectations. It's moved into sort of Clone Wars episodic expectations, and that's not a bad thing. I think the story is unfolding nicely every episode. I'm sad to go and see it end. It's meeting my expectations. It's highly rewatchable. I've watched each episode now a few times. And I'm still very interested to see, I think like everybody is, what the deal is with Omega. It appears as if the Kaminoans, at least right now, it seems as if they want her back to possibly create a new batch of clones, and her as the source. They haven't made that direct connection, and I might be missing a thread here, but right now it looks like Tarkin wants to shut down the clones, right, to bring in other soldiers to replace the clones for the Empire's stormtrooper army. The Kaminoans are worried about that, and they'd like to create a new batch of clones, but they don't have the source material anymore, and it sounds as if Omega might have been what they were planning on using, potentially, for the source. Either way, I'm really enjoying the intrigue of what this show is laying out. There is another item when it comes to the Bad Batch we'll talk about here in a moment from Inside the Magic, and this is where I mentioned at the start of the show an outlet that I had referenced before that I thought had some credibility. I might be taking back a little bit of that credibility, and I'll share with you what I mean here in just a moment. But there's an article that they released. Dave Filoni is erasing the Star Wars sequel's Snoke problem. And again, it sort of takes the angle that there was a problem there that's universal, that everybody agrees with, right? And that really is and always has been the thorn in my side when it comes to the current commentary around the sequel trilogy, is the assumptions that commentators make that what they are saying is what the majority of the fandom is saying, and it's just not true. The lack of the use of "in my opinion" hurts the fandom, and I have a couple of examples of that I will share with you again on the show this week. So, before we get into the heart of my commentary this week on a number of different issues, I want to reset the show a little bit. I haven't done this in a while, and if you are a newer listener to the show, I just want to take a moment to share my perspective of where I'm coming from when I give my commentary about all things related to Star Wars. I've been a Star Wars fan since I was a fan of anything else. Seeing A New Hope with my father in Rosemead, California when I was 5 years old, and having it, like it did for so many of us at that age, just completely change our lives. And I've been a fan of Star Wars ever since. It's ebbed and flowed throughout the years, but once the announcement of the prequel trilogies was made, I was all in, and have been following on a daily basis everything as it relates to Star Wars ever since then. Star Wars is fun, right? And what I try to do on this show is I try to ride that fine line between having healthy commentary. You can criticize, right? Not everything about Star Wars is perfect, of course not. But I try to ride that fine line between healthy commentary, but also not so heavy that it stops being fun. And this is for me personally. Sometimes I'll get heavy on the show, and we'll get deep into the storytelling and mythology and how it relates to today's world. And I think that there's some healthy commentary that you can have with regard to that. But there also is, at least in my opinion, a breaking point where people take it too seriously and they end up taking things too personally. And we've certainly seen that apparent in that toxic part of the fandom. So that's all I wanted to say, was that, look, Star Wars to me is fun. And if you're not having fun watching Star Wars, then why in the world are you watching it? If you don't like an aspect of Star Wars, then just don't watch it. It's really that simple. All right, so let's go ahead and get into a couple of different items, the core of the show this week here on My Nerd World, a Star Wars podcast.
We are the spark that light the fire that'll burn the First Order down.
So recently, I used Inside the Magic as a source for a particular news item that had come out. And I think it was related to the potential of Daisy Ridley talking with Disney and Lucasfilm about reprising her role in some way, shape, or form. That might have been it. Don't know much about Inside the Magic. However, I found this article heading into the show this week and was just kind of like, oh, I rolled my eyes and had to sigh. But it relates to something that I wanted to talk about on the show, so I'll share it with you and my thoughts on it. Rebecca Barton from Inside the Magic wrote this particular piece, and it's titled, Dave Filoni is Erasing the Star Wars Sequels Snoke Problem. The Star Wars sequel trilogy had some plot holes, at best, writes Rebecca. At worst, it completely ruined the Star Wars universe George Lucas spent decades upon decades of his life building. No matter which camp you fall into, we can all agree upon the fact that Supreme Leader Snoke was far from the best villain the Star Wars franchise has ever seen. All right, there are so many problems with both of those sentences. I'll just zero in on them and move on. First off, those aren't two things to be comparing. Star Wars sequel trilogy having some plot holes at best and at worst completely ruining Star Wars, no matter which Star Wars camp you fall into. It's the same issue she has with the second line. We can all agree that Supreme Leader Snoke was far from the best villain. Maybe we can't all agree. Maybe there are some people that really thought that Supreme Leader Snoke was a better villain than another villain out there. To the first point, right, plot holes, at worst it ruined no matter which Star Wars camp you fall into. It's like, wow, just lay out a really bad hand out of the gate on this particular piece there, Rebecca. Guess what? All the Star Wars movies have plot holes. I think a lot of what we deal with the fandom, and I don't know Rebecca's age, I'm going to guess Rebecca probably came to Star Wars at a bare minimum around the prequels, if not later. Okay, that's my guess. I suppose. You know what? You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do this. All right, so I just paused the show, went and did a little bit of Google, of internet, half-ass internet research on Rebecca Barton, and now I'm back. Yeah, based off her age, and that she's essentially grew up around the prequel trilogy. This is not a dig on Rebecca, right, per se, okay? I disagree with her opinion on this. It is more just a commentary, right? She's entitled to her opinion about how a lot of people view the fandom. And the reality is, guess what? All of the films have plot holes. Okay? They all do. You can't get around it. Okay. All right, so let's get more back into. I don't want to wipe out on just that opening paragraph because it's not the core of what she's talking about. So she goes on to say this. Snoke didn't really serve many purposes throughout The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, and the conclusion, The Rise of Skywalker. Okay, again, depends on your point of view, but be that as it may, let's move on. His origin story was never fully explained, and his primary purpose for existing seemed to be allow Kylo Ren to ultimately take over as Supreme Leader. He was essentially a placeholder for the former Ben Solo without a real story of his own. Okay. But again, using the Emperor as an example, that dude showed up looking completely different than what we ended up seeing him look like in the prequel trilogy, right, in The Empire Strikes Back, with no context whatsoever. He entered into Return of the Jedi having no idea where the dude came from, and yet we, as young people, all just accepted the fact that Palpatine was the bigger bad guy of the original trilogy and didn't really give a rip about his backstory. But that's not the world that we live in now, and more on that in a little bit. During The Mandalorian Season 2, showrunner Dave Favreau and Dave Filoni already started explaining Snoke's origin better than the Star Wars sequels ever did when they introduced Dr. Pershing and his clone experiments for Moff Gideon. Okay? Commentary. Now, here's my commentary on this. Look, I've covered this ground before. But the problem isn't the movies or the creative decisions behind them, in my opinion. The problem is the way that the fandom, certain segments of the fandom, go and try to dissect and break down their expectations. Star Wars has always been ambiguous. I've said this many times on the show. And again, while everybody is entitled to their opinion, there seems to be this desire to tear something down that you don't like by pointing to it and saying it didn't do this particular thing. But that usually takes place in the absence of other times that particular thing didn't happen, but nobody seemed to care. And really what it comes down to is it's this social networking world that we live in this world of podcasts that we live in, that has really shrunk our world down to the point where we have connectivity with an abundance of individuals that normally we wouldn't have connectivity with. And that bolsters opinions, it spreads misinformation, and while there's a lot of good that can come from it, there's also a lot of bad that can come from it too. Dave Filoni is erasing the Star Wars sequels' Snoke problem. Well, guess what? I don't think that the sequels had a Snoke problem. He served a purpose, and the storytellers went and told their story around that purpose to tell, in my opinion, a better story than we would have gotten if Snoke had remained the bad guy. If it was a Snoke problem, it was just a Snoke problem with relation to that article for the article writer Rebecca than it was for a majority of the fandom, or more specifically, this fan. But there's more to it than this, okay? So, for example, I was listening to Rebel Force Radio this week, and they've had a frequent guest on. His name is F.J. DeSanto. Now, F.J. DeSanto he's a writer. He's been most notably known for writing a bunch for the new Transformers cartoon series that have shown up on Netflix and other forms. Okay, and he's a frequent guest on Rebel Force Radio. So he's very critical of The Last Jedi, and he takes this absolutist position on their latest show about the sequels being a failure. And one of the examples in his mind that he gives is the 3-year gap versus the 2-year gap in the creation of the sequel trilogy versus the prequels and the original trilogy. And what FJ argues is that the 3-year gap and what it does for the creative process is that it allows time for things to simmer versus 2 years. And he makes arguments like if George hadn't had the 3 years between the Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, then we would have had Jar Jar Binks more prominent in Attack of the Clones and in Revenge of the Sith. Okay, that is an opinion, and one that I don't agree with, because one could easily go and argue that you could overthink things with 3 years versus 2 years, let outside influences muddy good storytelling. Beyond that, though, again, it comes down to a matter of perspective. FJ DeSanto wasn't saying, in my opinion, he was stating what he was saying as if it were fact. The sequel trilogy sucked. It wasn't in his mind. He was stating it like everybody agrees with that, and then trying to craft arguments around that to explain his position, to which the hosts ended up actually saying, and I couldn't believe it, they said, what do you say to sequel apologists when they say George Lucas, here's just an example, what do you say to sequel apologists who say that George Lucas had complete control over the prequel trilogy and he wrote the whole thing? Because FJ was complaining about having different writers come in to craft the story, and why didn't they plot the whole thing out? And FJ's argument or rebuttal to that was, well, George was the creator and the owner of this, and he could do whatever he wants. Well, the same thing can be said for those that own the rights to Star Wars now, since George sold it, who went and made the sequel trilogy. The point I wanted to make, though, was I couldn't believe these hosts were saying that, what do you say to sequel apologists? If you liked the sequels, you are only an apologist for them. Again, that's the part of the fandom that's really hurting the overall conversation, in my opinion. Well, guess what? I love the sequels. And in my opinion, they added to an amazing set of trilogies with a unique story, just like the prequels were unique to themselves and just like the original trilogy was unique to itself. if you stripped out the social networking aspect of the world that we're living in right now, I'm convinced you'd have a much different commentary, not only coming out of The Last Jedi, positive and negative, but also out of the Rise of Skywalker 2, positive and negative. But unfortunately, people are tribal. They want to get into their particular groups. And maybe I am a victim of that too, since I really do love the sequels and feel the need to add a positive spin on the negativity that's out there. Who knows? I go back to what I said at the start of the show. Star Wars is fun. And I love watching the good and the bad. It's funny to me how people can... I wish people could criticize the movies, the modern films that they don't like in the same way that they do, and they give, say, a free pass to the Ewok movies, right? Maybe that's an unfair comparison, but it makes me laugh where people will go and watch, yeah, they're bad, but I still go watch them anyways. They're still fun. You don't get that around the sequel trilogy. Even people that don't like The Rise of Skywalker, you don't get, it's bad, but it's still a lot of fun to sit down and watch. I just don't understand sometimes.
This is not going to go the way you think.
All right, J.J. Abrams talked to Collider, and this is what I really wanted to get into on the show this week, which brought me around to wanting to talk more positively and get deeper into what The Rise of Skywalker gave us. But J.J. Abrams sat down with Collider and was asked about his recent work, and this is what J.J. Abrams had to say. Well, I'll say the opportunity to get to work on any pre-existing franchise is definitely a double-edged sword, and while I'm incredibly grateful and proud to have been involved in the projects, of course, all I see is what things could have been and what they might have done, right? And I think that goes for anybody. A lot of people have been taking, because several podcasts have pointed out to these quotes and have been using it on their shows this week. So I'm not doing anything special that other people haven't done already, but I found it just as equally as interesting as other shows did. But a lot of people have been zeroing in on that particular quote, and while I'm incredibly grateful and proud to have been involved in these projects, of course, all I see is what things could have been and what we might have done. Now, look, he could have been talking about Star Trek just as much as he could have been talking about Star Wars, and I think that any creator of content is going to feel that way. I think about that about my books for what it's worth. Shameless, book promotion. But writing my EMBARK series, I go back and I look at the original, the first three that are a trilogy, and I think, I wonder if I had done this, or I wonder if I had done that. I'm in the process of wrapping up book 6 in the series after writing book 5, which kicks off a brand new trilogy. And as I'm writing book 6, I'm like, I wonder if I had done that in book 5, if I could have done this in 6. But it's too late now. I think this is just something that creators of content do. He goes on to say, the importance of it is not lost on me as temporary custodians of any ideas, whether they pre-exist us or not, which is to say that I think even with an original idea, somehow I still don't quite understand where that creative impulse comes from and how the experience of writing something really is yours. I feel like we're all just channeling something that we're trying to serve as opposed to something that we are doing that is our work. Asked whether he would be directing DC movies with Bad Robot producing, the Star Wars Rise of Skywalker filmmaker said he's eager for his next project to be an original story versus wading back into tackling existing IP himself. And then he says, I know that Hollywood is a place where it used to be that people would be inspired by something that they would see, or an old film or a show or something, and think, oh, here's my response to that. Here's my version of that. And look, that's what it's become a place, he goes on to say before I add my commentary. It's become a place where more often than not, you see people, you see something and people get inspired by it and go, let's redo that exact thing. I feel like as someone who started writing television and telling original stories on film and TV, it is something that I really do miss. A few things that I'm working on right now as a writer on original ideas. I just feel as a director, we really would love to have my next projects be things that didn't pre-exist me necessarily. Okay. A couple of things about that comment. It's interesting when you get to the first part of that, it's become a place where more often than not you see people get inspired by it and go, let's do the exact same thing. As opposed to, oh, here's my response to this thing, old film or show, let's do a version of that. Look, one of the brilliant things that George Lucas did was he went all the way back to the mythology, right? The mythology that's been there for centuries and broke it down to its essence to create Star Wars and that original story in A New Hope. And essentially the three movies, because he wrote it as one big film and then broke it up under three films. Or wrote it as one big story and broke it up into three stories. Going and researching and studying the works of Joseph Campbell, right? That talked about heroes and myth building. I mean, that's what George did. George, right, saw an old film, saw an old TV show, Flash Gordon. Here's my response to that. Here's my version of that. And then JJ says, it's become a place where more often than not you see something and people get inspired and go, let's redo that exact same thing. And yes, we have definitely seen that, but there is a fine line between redoing that exact same thing and then also being inspired by that thing. One of the reasons why, look, The Mandalorian is so successful, and I'll agree with Jon Favreau on this, he wasn't inspired by Star Wars and George Lucas. He tried to be inspired by the things that inspired Star Wars and George Lucas, right? Wherein, when I wrote, again, shameless plug, when I wrote and started writing my EMBARK series, I was inspired by George Lucas, who was inspired by those other things. All right. Beyond that, though, getting into Star Wars and the Star Wars aspect of this, of what J.J. Abrams has created, right? The Force Awakens was the intro, okay? Talking about what J.J. Abrams, Rian Johnson, and then J.J. and Chris Terrio did with this sequel trilogy and how it relates to the comments that J.J. Abrams made here, right? So The Force Awakens was the intro, right? We have a movie that's almost as much Rey's movie as it is Kylo's, but it's presented in a somewhat even-handed way between Rey, Finn, Poe, and Kylo Ren, right? And this is this is the aspect when you back away from the sequel trilogy and kind of look at it all together as one piece that I find really, really interesting. Is that first movie, and I haven't done the math on the time spent on screen, I think that we as moviegoers sort of focus it on being Rey's film. But next time you go and watch The Force Awakens, pay attention to Kylo Ren and the amount of screen time that's given to him developing his character and what he is dealing with in terms of his own anger, his sort of reverse Vader, where he's feeling pulled to the light and he wants to go back to the dark side. In The Last Jedi, you get Rey's movie with Ben Solo's continued journey, right, between the two of them, right? And then in The Rise of Skywalker, you kind of get Ben's movie with Rey's continued journey to their finale, but presented again in a very even-handed way. The Rise of Skywalker is just as deep, right, as The Last Jedi is, in my opinion, but it's presented in a more mainstream Star Wars fashion. So let's get into what JJ said and how I think it relates to what he created. And I'm just, again, sort of just speculating here, right? So what The Rise of Skywalker really was, okay? If The Force Awakens was, as JJ said, Hollywood is a place where it used to be that people would be inspired by something that they would see in an old film or a show and think, oh, here's my response to that. Here's a version of that. It's become a place more often than not when you see people who get inspired by it and go, let's redo that exact thing. And The Force Awakens was kind of a combination of those two, right? And that was the balancing act that J.J. Abrams had to take. It was this, all right, I want to be inspired by the old Star Wars, but at the same time, it also has to be something that's very similar, not exactly the same thing, but pretty darn close. Okay. So, for The Rise of Skywalker, perhaps, in my opinion, when you get into Hollywood is a place where it used to be that people would be inspired by something that they would see, an old film or show, and think, oh, here's my response to that. Here's a version of that. I think that The Force Awakens is more of a closer to, let's do something that's almost the exact same thing. When J.J. Abrams got the opportunity to come back and close out the sequel trilogy and all 9 films, to me, it's J.J. saying, here is my response to that. Here is my version of that. Right. Okay. The Rise of Skywalker, in my opinion, was just as brave and just as controversial as The Rise of Skywalker. Certainly as divisive on a number of levels, right? But without the deep dives from people who loved it. And why? I was listening to, and I won't mention the show and the guest because I just, for the sake of this commentary, I don't want to, but I was listening to another podcast, and they had a fan of The Last Jedi on there. And they were getting into these really deep discussions about The Last Jedi and Rey and how deep it was and how it compared to all these other things and the Reylo community, of which I was a Reylo, but I'm also a Reylo that thought the decision to have Ben Solo die was a good one. But there's a lot of depth inside of The Rise of Skywalker and things that can be discussed, and it's not. And this is one of the biggest reasons I think for why that is. It's because it was, for now, the end of the story. It was the end of the Skywalker line. The Last Jedi had commentary legs because we still had room to grow. We still had another movie coming. And there was a lot of speculation that could dovetail off of the Last Jedi into The Rise of Skywalker. The Rise of Skywalker is in the same spot that Rogue One is. What is there to talk about? Now, granted, The Rise of Skywalker is more divisive than Rogue One. Rogue One isn't very divisive at all, but Rogue One is revered by a lot of people. For example, that content creator, the writer that I mentioned earlier from Rebel Force Radio, F.J. Santo, he said that he felt that Rogue One was a masterpiece and one of the greatest Star Wars movies ever made. But guess what? We don't really talk about it. We don't do deep dive dissertations on Rogue One. And why? Well, because the story ended. It's not a bad thing. It doesn't take away from the movie. It's just the nature of how the fandom goes and decides what it is that interests them more. And I think when it comes to The Rise of Skywalker, it's been dealt a pretty bad hand because it's the end of the line, and therefore people don't spend nearly as much time discussing all of the different little nuances in that film the same way that they did The Last Jedi. Well, guess what? I still want to talk about it because there's a lot of depth in that movie. There are caves filled with kyber crystals to be mined from The Rise of Skywalker. Ben Solo in his turn back to the light. His relationship with his mom, right? Starting with The Last Jedi and what happened in that film when he couldn't, press his thumb down to fire on the ship his mom was on, right? But his fellow TIE fighter pilots did, and him believing for that time period that his mom was dead. The relationship that's there, that started in The Last Jedi, that Chris Terrio and J.J. Abrams brought to fruition in a very, very unique way, given the fact that, unfortunately, we lost Carrie Fisher, so she wasn't even there. I mean, they deserve credit just for that. We can get into Leia and Her Sacrifice. Same thing. The fact that they took what they had of Carrie Fisher's performance from the other films and crafted this really interesting story, right? What Her Sacrifice did in allowing Ben Solo to turn from the dark to the light to bring him to the place where he could go and save Rey at the end of that film. Poe and his rise within the Resistance, which doesn't get talked about nearly enough, in my opinion. Same thing with Finn as well. This continued commentary around Finn and how he got short-handed in these films, I just do not understand. He had a major plot line in The Last Jedi, and it continued in The Rise of Skywalker and culminated in him and Janna essentially saving everybody at the end of that film by taking down that Star Destroyer. It's a really cool story. And then, of course, you get into Rey. right? Her parents and being a Palpatine. And let's pause right there for a second, right? And I'll dive deeper into this in later episodes. I think a lot of people didn't like the introduction of Palpatine, and because of that, they didn't really want to discuss what it could mean. So much commentary circled around Rey in The Last Jedi because of finger touching lovin' and the Force connection that they had and what Rian Johnson did. But again, I feel like Chris Terrio and J.J. Abrams are not given the credit that they deserve by expanding upon that, continuing to do and grow what Rian Johnson introduced in The Last Jedi and bringing it into The Rise of Skywalker with that continued connection. And Rey, finding out that she was a Palpatine, I know it gets dismissed and not talked about because so many people wanted her to be a nobody, but be that as it may, let's go and talk about what an emotional gut punch that is. It brought Rey in The Rise of Skywalker to risk everything. She was willing to turn her back on her friends. She bailed on them to go into the remnants of the Death Star 2, to risk it, to go get the Wayfinder. Why? So she could get to Exegol and do what? To kill Palpatine, to stop Palpatine. And she was turning her backs on her friends to do it. She was willing to go and risk everything to destroy her past. Let the past die. Kill it if you have to. And this is where, again, I don't think The Rise of Skywalker gets nearly as much credit. As a matter of fact, it gets criticized for this, which boggles my mind. That The Rise of Skywalker gets criticized as retconning The Last Jedi, when in my opinion, it does completely the opposite. It takes what Rian Johnson laid out, and it bumps it up a notch. In The Last Jedi, Kylo Ren said, let the past die. Kill it if you have to. In The Rise of Skywalker, Rey is doing everything she can to do just that, to kill her own past. Look, there's a wealth of discussion and deep dives into The Last Jedi that has added to the enjoyment of that film. But let's be honest, Rian Johnson had to continue the story. He didn't have to end it. That wasn't his job. That task went to J.J. Abrams and Chris Terrio. And there is no conclusion that would have satisfied everyone. So, as someone who enjoys The Rise of Skywalker immensely, let me say that J.J. and Chris Terrio are not getting enough credit for what they achieved. A wickedly fast-paced, exciting, fun, deep, and emotional conclusion that in less than 2.5 hours wrapped up 9 films and over 40 years of storytelling. Talk about a Herculean task. And look, just for this week, let's talk a bit about the prologue. And what the prologue is, in my opinion, isn't the crawl that takes place at the beginning of The Rise of Skywalker. It would have been very easy to go and sort of slip in what J.J. did at the beginning of The Rise of Skywalker into the crawl. No, the prologue is, in my opinion, those opening scenes that we get of The Rise of Skywalker. Kylo Ren finding the Wayfinder, Poe and Finn getting the intel from the spy in the First Order. Like many that watched The Last Jedi one time, got confused by it, but then grew to love it on second, third, and repeat viewings, and started to appreciate it. In my opinion, the same thing can be said for the opening of The Rise of Skywalker. I know a lot of people complained about it. It was rapid, absolutely, but it was clever and succinct in its storytelling and setting up perfectly the stakes of the film. Kylo Ren, after The Last Jedi, thinks that he's now supreme leader, but Palpatine is back, and he realizes, once he goes and finds him, that he can actually be more powerful with Palpatine. But therein lies the heart of the conflict that is Rey. It's here that Kylo Ren / a wanting to be redeemed Ben Solo starts to realize why Rey is so special and that they are a dyad. A concept that is, I mean, it is ingrained within Star Wars, even though we hadn't heard of it before. This idea of Force connections, okay? This dyad in the Force. We get this awesome action sequence with Poe and with Finn, right? And the Millennium Falcon, leading into Rey's training. And she's an incredibly skilled individual by this point in time, right? That training sequence does not get also nearly as much credit as it deserves. She's a bad A in that sequence. That move that she does at the end before the tree falls down on BB-8, where she throws the lightsaber, picks up her staff, takes out the training remote, then catches the lightsaber. Man, that is an awesome sequence. I mean, and talk about just amazing Jedi skills. That all leads to the core group coming together and being set off on their adventure. Look, if The Rise of Skywalker were a live-action series and they broke it up into several episodes, and the first episode ended with their departure, Poe, Finn, 3PO, Chewbacca, and Rey, and the first episode of this Rise of Skywalker live-action series ended with their departure to Pasaana, it would be met with high praise in my opinion. The Rise of Skywalker was always going to be difficult to please everybody, especially coming off of a series like Marvel and Endgame and what they were able to accomplish with that. And I personally believe that as we get further down the line and eventually we get an episode 10 and 11, the sequel trilogy is going to be looked at with much kinder eyes down the line when we have some perspective on it. All three of these Star Wars trilogies were incredibly unique in and of themselves and brought something different to all three trilogies. And the sequel trilogy absolutely did that in this really fascinating, deep, emotional storytelling of these old group of heroes from the original trilogy, these Skywalkers, this new character of Rey that happens to be a Palpatine, Kylo Ren, right, the son of Han Solo and Princess Leia, and finding out that these two had a connection. Again, I really do feel that this is going to be looked at way in a much, much better light down the line than it is right now. So I'm going to continue my conversations and getting more into The Rise of Skywalker because, like I said, I believe that it deserves it. I'd love to hear from you. TalkShowNerd at gmail.com and leave a comment up on YouTube as well. Before we get into listener feedback, a little bit of a programming note. I'll be traveling to Phoenix next weekend. I'll be back on Sunday. I don't know if there will be another new show next week. I will try to get one out either Sunday or Monday. But one of the things we will be talking about on an upcoming episode, along with more Rise of Skywalker commentary, is also some of the changes that I found in the Rise of Skywalker graphic novel that are really interesting. I don't know whether or not these were originally in the script this way, or if these were editorial changes that the comic book writers were able to make, that they were allowed to make. But there's some really interesting changing and moving of different story beats from the graphic novel that actually, I'll be honest, some of the things that got changed in the graphic novel for The Rise of Skywalker I thought worked better. But that being said, I also don't think they could have filmed them this way. And again, I'll explain this on next week's episode. So again, TalkShowNerd at gmail.com or leave a comment up on YouTube. Now let's get into some listener feedback.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
Thank you to everybody who did email over the course of the week. A lot of them were just positive comments from friends of the show. So I just wanted to say I really do appreciate those comments, and I look forward to hearing from you again this coming week. I just want to focus on one particular email from friend of the show, Brian Martin, that I've been holding on to for a while, and I mentioned it at the start of the show. But he wrote several weeks back, could you please do an episode comparing Dark Empire and The Rise of Skywalker as two stories set in different continuities that both have Palpatine's resurrection as the big plot point? So I cheated, and I went to inverse.com because they already put together an article. The 5 big takeaways of The Rise of Skywalker that match with The Dark Empire. And if you've never read the Dark Empire comic book series, it really is a really interesting read. For all the reasons I'm about to lay out. I read it in the lead up to The Rise of Skywalker. And once I went and saw the movie, I went, oh yeah, there are a lot of parallels here. So here are the 5 big ones. Number 5, the Emperor used cloning to come back. The Rise of Skywalker strongly hints that Palpatine used cloning to bring himself back to life. It's never totally clear, but Palps is clearly doing some cloning at his hideout on Exegol, so it seems like a feasible explanation for his return. In Dark Empire, things are a little bit more clear. Palpatine is back after reviving his spirit in a new clone body. Even worse, if someone manages to kill him, he can simply jump to another clone. So was this how Palpatine survived in The Rise of Skywalker? It's as good an explanation as anything else I've heard so far, according to the article writer. And I really do think, getting back to Rebecca's article from Inside the Magic, I do think that the Bad Batch, the Mandalorian, and the storytelling group are fleshing out the means at which Palpatine may have been able to do what he did, which I think is really interesting. Which is, again, not different than what we've seen in the past when it comes to the major theatrical releases and the ancillary storytelling. We have this new thing now called live-action TV shows where they could flesh this out even more. But like I said, in the original trilogy, there was tons of ambiguity. Clone Wars, the Old Republic, like I said before, Palpatine showing up, not even knowing who he was, right? And all these things ended up being revealed later. So what they're doing is very much in line with what Star Wars has always done. We just live in a world now where if people don't immediately get an answer, they don't just talk about it amongst their friends as, boy, I can't wait to find out what the deal was with Snoke. You have to go online and pump out theories and hoping you can be the one that gets it right, that everybody goes and creates a headcanon around, just as an example. Number 4 of the 5 big the ways The Rise of Skywalker matches up with the Dark Empire. A secret Sith planet is revealed in The Rise of Skywalker. Of course, it's called Exegol, hiding out in the unknown regions where Palpatine has been hanging out. In the Dark Empire, the Emperor is chilling on a creepy planet called Biss, B-Y-S-S. Now, Biss was not considered canon after Disney rebooted it around 2014. But at least one game for The Force Awakens includes Biss on a hyperspace map. Meanwhile, Exegol is a totally new creation. I will say that if I had the chance to interview Chris Terrio and J.J. Abrams, I would ask them why they didn't choose, say, planets that we've already known associated with the Sith, like Dathomir. Why didn't they choose a planet like that? And why did they come up with something new? I'd be curious to find the answer, because I wonder if it isn't something more like Disney and Lucasfilm didn't want them to do that because they wanted to leave. They didn't want to cement those particular planets and locations to The Rise of Skywalker in case they wanted to do something with them later on. But I would definitely be interested to find out what the reason was behind it. Personally, I don't have an issue with it. Holy cow, I just had this massive sneezing fit. See, what a professional I am. I paused the show to do my sneezing fit, only to unpause it to tell you I just had a sneezing fit. Number 3 on the 5 big takeaways The Rise of Skywalker matches up with the Dark Empire. The Emperor introduces his return with some kind of weird Force broadcast across the galaxy. The film's open crawl starts by telling us the Emperor has sent out a spooky message to all the galaxy, in which he reveals his return and makes some sort of threat. He does something very similar towards the end of the Dark Empire. The big difference there, though, is he claims that he doesn't give a crap about the Alliance. He only cares about taking out the Skywalkers. Which, honestly, isn't that far even removed from what The Rise of Skywalker did, because when you get into sort of Palpatine's true motivations, that was kind of part of it as well, right? Number 2, the Emperor's plan to possess Rey/Leia. Towards the end of The Rise of Skywalker, Palpatine says that if Rey kills him, he will live inside of her. It's an interesting twist that suggests the rule of 2 is more complicated than we thought. Palps basically reveals that every time a Sith apprentice kills their master, all the previous Sith spirits pass into the killer. This is kind of similar to what the Emperor says to Leia in the Dark Empire. When Leia threatens to kill the Emperor in the comic, he says, "Perhaps I'll even live on in you." So the idea of a dead Sith inhabiting the body of a murderer isn't exactly new to Star Wars. And number 1 on the list of the comparisons between the Rise of Skywalker and Dark Empire from Inverse. Luke turns to the dark side / Rey is tempted by the dark side. In Dark Empire, Luke straight up turns to the dark side because he wants to topple it from within. This is sort of similar to the idea that Rey has a vision of becoming the Sith Empress. Also, Luke's entire persona in the Dark Empire is pretty similar to Kylo Ren, and even some of his outfits are the same. So, Brian, Martin, I hope that satisfies your curiosity about the connections between the two. And again, that will be something that we'll talk about in a future show, because getting into the depth of what the Rise of Skywalker presented us with, what Rey was dealing with in that story. And I'm really going to spend some time on this. I find it really interesting. I know that the Rise of Skywalker takes a ton of heat for bringing Palpatine back. And everybody is entitled to their opinion. But I'm very much of my own opinion that is ripe to be discussed and talked about. Because it's a very, very interesting dynamic to think about what, again, if we're getting into sort of the emotional dealings of the characters in these films, what must have been like for Rey to see visions of what could be, to find out that she was a Palpatine after all this time, wanting to find out who her parents were. And again, that's something that doesn't ever get talked about. Because really, we all, as kids, okay, let me not say we all, the majority of us, me personally, was really impacted by Luke finding out that Vader was his father. Because he was searching for he missed his family. Right? I wish I knew him, right? When he's talking to Obi-Wan Kenobi. I wish I knew my father, when he's so happy to be able to get some sort of background on who his dad was. And then we find out in The Empire Strikes Back that it's Vader. I'm like, oh my gosh. But J.J. Abrams and Chris Terrio don't get any credit for being poetic in that story beat in The Rise of Skywalker, even though it took place like a movie out from where it took place in the original trilogy, in making Palpatine Rey's, grandfather. And again, like I mentioned earlier, what an emotional gut punch that must have been. And then seeing the visions and fighting, even for a short period of time, the dark side version of herself. There's so much good stuff in that movie. And again, I look forward to covering on the show, and I hope that you enjoy listening to it. I did think a bit about whether or not I wanted to go down that road, how many individuals would be interested in hearing deeper dives into the mythology of the Rise of Skywalker. But I really want to talk about it, and I hope that regardless of your feelings of the Rise of Skywalker, that my enthusiasm and enjoyment of that film might be enough to keep you entertained to listen, even if it's a film that you disagree with in a lot of ways. So Star Wars is fun, and I want this podcast to be fun. Thanks so much for checking out the show. As always, if you want to support my nerd world, and you haven't done so already, and you're a newer listener to the show, back around 2015, I decided to do something I never thought I would do, and that is try to write a novel. And I had a story in my head inspired by the science fiction stories of my youth, and certainly George Lucas, and I titled it EMBARK. EMBARK Book 1, the story is this. Katha has found something, and humanity won't survive without it. In the future, global corporations D-Corp and Enercon have made interstellar travel possible and spaceflight available to all humanity. The stars are now within reach, and Earth's superpowers are locked in a tense debate over who will colonize the newly discovered distant worlds. When headstrong Katha Morrow receives a cryptic message from her father, an aerospace engineer, 1 year after his death, fellow pilot and friend Taft Guardia eagerly agrees to help investigate. As they embark on their quest, an industrial accident within D-Corp sets off a catastrophic chain of events that threatens Earth, forcing a planet-wide evacuation. During the chaos, Katha and Taft make a shocking discovery that may hold the key to saving humanity from the tyranny of D-Corp's evil leader. EMBARK is a fast-paced and action-packed apocalyptic space opera, and Book 1 in the ongoing series. Book 5, The Rocket Queen, just came out about a month ago, and all 5 books are available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook. The ebook for Embark Book 1 is only 99 cents as your introduction into the series. The other ebooks run $2.99, and the paperbacks are anywhere between $12.99 and $8.99. And they're all also available in audiobook. So I hope you'll support the show and head right now to Amazon.com and pick up your preferred version of Embark Book 1 if you haven't yet. And if you have, thank you so much for purchasing the books. I hope you enjoyed the stories, and you've had the opportunity to go and leave reviews for the books that you've either listened to or read. I can use all the reviews I could get. I really would appreciate it. That wraps up the show this week. We'll be back sometime next week for your Memorial Day weekend, so either Sunday or Monday. I'll definitely try to get a show out. It's just going to be a little bit later because I'm traveling to see my mom, who I haven't seen in entirely too long, in just north of Phoenix. So have yourself a fantastic week. I hope, again, you are safe and happy and healthy wherever you are, and I'll talk to you again real soon. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My Nerd World.